The lamp had burned down to almost nothing, and I sat at the kitchen table watching the wick because I could not look at the doorway where he stood with my coat in his hands. My infant son was asleep in the next room. I could hear my mother-in-law's footsteps overhead, slow and certain, like she already knew. And my husband, the man I had stood beside before God and 300 witnesses, held out my coat and told me it was time for me to go to my parents' house. The baby would stay. The baby always stayed. I was 23 the first time. I would be 26 the second. Before I tell you about the rule and how a man can use it twice in one marriage, let me tell you who I am. My name is Anna. I grew up Old Order Amish in a settlement in Holmes County, and I am 79 years old now. I have outlived nearly everyone who could contradict me, which is its own kind of permission. This is Hannah, the Amish girl. The channel where the things we were never allowed to say out loud are finally said. If you have ever lived under a rule that was never written down, but governed your whole life, subscribe and stay with me, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever heard of a husband being permitted to send his wife away? I want to know what you were taught. Now let me explain what I mean, because I know how it sounds. When people picture the Amish, they picture simplicity, buggies, quilts, a gentle people who keep to themselves, and much of that is true, and much of it I still love. But underneath the quietness there is the Ordnung, the unwritten order, the rules that are never printed and never questioned, that decide what a person may do and what a person must endure. The Ordnung is not the same in every district. It bends from one settlement to the next, one bishop to the next. And in the district where I was married, there was an understanding among the men, half custom and half scripture twisted to fit, that a husband whose household had fallen into disorder could send his wife back to her father's roof for a season of correction, to be made right, to learn submission again. They called it being set back. I never heard it spoken from the pulpit. That is the thing about the rules that hurt you most. They are never the loud ones. They live in the silence, passed between men, the way a tool is handed across a fence, without ceremony, without anyone writing down that it happened. I married Jacob in November after the harvest, the way it was always done. I was 20 years old. He was 28, older, settled, with 80 acres his father had signed to him, and a reputation as a hard worker and a harder man. I did not know him well. In my time, you did not need to. You knew his family was upright. You knew he had been baptized. You knew the bishop approved. The rest you were expected to learn after the vows, in the dark, the way we learned everything. For the first 2 years, it was a marriage like the ones around me. He was not cruel in the way a stranger would notice. He did not raise his hand, but he had a coldness that arrived like weather, and a way of going silent for days that made the whole house hold its breath. I learned to read the set of his shoulders the way a farmer reads the sky. I cooked, I cleaned, I tended the garden. I sat beside him in church and bowed my head. And I waited, as every young wife waited, for the children God would send. The first child came when I was 23, a son. I will not pretend the birth was easy, because it was not, and there was no doctor. Only my mother and the midwife and a long night I do not have the words for even now. But he came healthy, and he was beautiful, and for 9 days I held him, and believed that something in me had finally done what it was meant to do. On the 10th day, the house changed. I was tired in the way new mothers are tired, the kind that lives in your bones. The meals came late, the wash piled up. The baby cried in the night, and I could not always quiet him before he woke the others. And my mother-in-law, who lived under our roof, as was the custom, began to speak to Jacob in low tones in the evenings by the stove, where she thought I could not hear. She said the household had gone soft. She said I was favoring the child over my duties. She said a word I had heard before, but never about myself. Hochmut, pride, the greatest sin we knew, as though loving my own son too much were a kind of vanity. And one evening, Jacob stood in the kitchen doorway with my coat in his hands. "You are tired," he said. "You are not yourself. You will go to your mother's house and rest and remember your place. And when you are ready to keep this home as it should be kept, I will send for you. The boy stays here. He has a grandmother to nurse him through. I want you to understand that I did not scream. I did not weep, not then. I had been raised since before I could walk to believe that a wife yields, that a husband leads, that to argue was to sin twice, once against him and once against God. So I put on the coat. I walked out into the cold November dark, and my father's buggy came for me. And behind me, in a lit window, my 9-day-old son slept in another woman's arms. Let me be completely honest with you. The thing that broke me was not the leaving. It was the milk. My body did not know I had been sent away. My body kept making milk for a child who was not there, and every few hours the ache would come, and I would sit in my childhood bedroom, the same room where I had once lain awake dreaming of the husband who would choose me, and I would press cloths to myself and bite down and make no sound, because even my parents' house was full of ears. I stayed away for 11 Sundays. What happened over the next 11 Sundays, Kai? I cannot carry it in 20 minutes. There are things this recording cannot hold. The names, the counting, the drawer, the dress I kept for 27 years. 3 years ago, I wrote it all down. The book is called The Sundays. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. I counted the Sundays because Sunday was the only marker I had. I could not visit when I pleased. I could not send word freely. Twice in those 11 weeks I was permitted to see my son, brought to my parents' house by my mother-in-law for one afternoon, handed to me already fed, already changed, already smelling of another woman's soap. He did not know me. By the end, he had stopped looking for me the way an infant looks for the one who carried him. That is a thing you do not recover from. I have buried a husband and outlived most of my friends. And I tell you, the worst grief of my long life was watching my own child not know my face. Now here is what I learned later and what I need you to understand, because it is the whole heart of why I am speaking. I was not the only one. There was a woman in the next district, Mary, sent back twice in 5 years. There was a woman named Sarah Baylor, whose husband set her back after a stillbirth, of all the cruel times to do it, when she most needed her own home. We did not talk about it openly. We never talked about anything openly, but we knew. At the quilting frolics, an older woman would say a sentence that sounded like nothing, that sounded like she was talking about the weather or the canning, and the younger women would go quiet and understand. The rule was real. It was just never named in daylight. When Jacob finally sent for me, 11 Sundays in, there was no apology. There was a buggy at my father's door and a message that the house was ready for me to keep again. I went back. Of course I went back. There was no leaving in those years. To leave was to be shunned, the Meidung, to lose your family and your church and your place in the only world you had ever known, all at once, forever. So I returned to my husband, and I took up my son, who barely knew me, and I taught him my face again, week by week, the way you tame something wild. And I told myself it would not happen again. It happened again when I was 26. A second child, a daughter this time, and the same exhaustion, and the same low voices by the stove, and the same coat held out in the same doorway. He used it twice. The second time I did not even cry in front of him. I had learned. I put on the coat. I counted the Sundays. 6 that time. He needed me back sooner because the first boy was old enough to miss the work I did and not old enough to do it himself. Twice. A rule no one would print, no one would preach, no one would defend if you asked them to their face. And yet there it was, handed to him like a tool across a fence, used twice on the same woman. And not one soul in my world stood in the doorway and said, "This is wrong." I want to tell you about Jacob, because it matters, and because I am too old now for the easy comfort of making him a monster. He was a man who had been raised exactly as I had been raised, in silence, in submission to whatever came down from the men above him, taught that order in the home was a sign of righteousness and that a soft household shamed him in front of the district. He was doing what he had been taught was his duty. That does not make it right. I have spent more years than you have been alive learning that a thing can be a man's sincere duty and a deep wrong at the very same time. But the cruelty was never only his. The cruelty was the system that put that coat in his hands and called it holy. I stayed in that marriage for the rest of his life. We had more children. There were ordinary years, even gentle ones. Mornings at the stove with the windows going gold, a grandchild on my knee, the long settled quiet of 2 people who have outlasted their own storms. I will not pretend it was all darkness, but I never once forgot the count. 11 and 6. 17 Sundays of my life when my children grew without me, because a rule decided I was not fit to be in my own home. When Jacob passed, I was 61, and for the first time in my life, no one had the authority to send me anywhere. Do you know what that does to a person, to feel that for the first time at 61? I sat in my own kitchen, in my own house, and no coat was held out to me. And I understood in my body what I had never been allowed to understand in words. That I had been a grown woman, a mother, baptized and faithful, and I had still belonged to someone else's idea of order. It took me years and the quiet help of an English counselor. I saw in secret to find the words for what had been done. Autonomy. I had never had a word for it. Consent. We did not have that word for a wife in my time. The counselor said something to me. I have turned over every single day since. She said, control does not always look like a raised hand. Sometimes it looks like a coat held out in a doorway and a word that is never written down. The Amish world gave me things I carry still and would not give back. A faith that has held me through every grave I have stood beside. Hands that still know how to work. A community that showed up for every birth and every burial without being asked. I am not here to tell you those people are evil. I am here to tell you that good people can guard a cruel rule with their silence and call that silence peace. If you have ever been sent away from your own life by someone who said it was for your own good, If you were ever made to feel that your love for your own child was a kind of pride to be corrected, I see you. You were not too much. You were never too much. The rule was wrong, not you. There is so much I have not said. The names, the counting, the drawer where I kept the cloths, the dress I held on to for 27 years and could not tell you why until I wrote it down. The Sundays, what 20 minutes cannot hold. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. Tell me in the comments what part of this stayed with you. Tell me your own story, if today is the day you are ready to tell it. And if you want to hear more from behind the prayer cap, from a woman who has had 79 years to learn what the silence cost, subscribe to Hannah, the Amish girl. The morning is yours if you decide it is.